Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Not Just Politics podcast. Today is Friday, September 13th. Ooh.
Ooh. Scary movie night in my house.
So hopefully nothing spooky happens. I should have planned something.
Yeah.
I should have had like a breakout, like a costume or like a Charlie Brown style, like a ghost with the cutout eyes or whatever, something.
Well, Charlie Brown had like a dozen eyes on his. Is what it was called.
No, that's true. He did. I forgot about that. He had a ton. All right. Today's guest is the assistant professor of history at Point Park University, Dr. Josh Wolf. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
How's everything going?
Good. Good semester so far.
Yep.
I like the way all my classes have started. Yeah, I'm satisfied.
I am in one of your classes.
You are, as is Gavin, actually.
Yes, both of us are taking class from you. Gavin's in your...
Protest music, history of American protest music.
That's actually really interesting. And then I am in U.S. History 2.
Yes.
And we are currently in the Gilded Age.
But so Grace Lawrence is in both classes.
Yes.
And I've warned her. I was like, hey, just so you know, there's going to be a lot of overlapping material.
Isn't Ethan Rowinski also?
So Ethan was registered for Age of Democratic Revolution and US 2, but he ended up having to drop Age of Democratic Revolution for his internship. So yeah, originally he was in 2 classes as well, but not anymore.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, that's funny. Yeah.
But I've had Ethan like 4 semesters in a row. So,
really?
Yeah, he just keeps taking my classes.
Keeps coming back. It's a good sign, right?
I suppose, yeah.
So your concentration with history is political history. You also get into the history of race
and violence.
And violence, yes. So those are the main ones. So today we will be doing a little bit of a deep dive on the history of political division. That's the plan. Mm-hmm. So I would like to start. Let's start at the beginning, the founding of the country with Jefferson and Hamilton.
Yes,
because those two are two very big forces in the founding of this country. What are the fundamental differences between those two and the visions that they had for where they wanted the country to go?
Sure. So very rapidly, when Jefferson and Hamilton joined the Washington administration, Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Jefferson as the first Secretary of State, it's clear right away that they have different interpretations of the Constitution. They have different visions for what the future of the United States should look like. Hamilton was very much European-minded, and he felt like the United States' best future was tied into our trade relations with Europe. And in particular, he felt that Great Britain was the most stable, steady trading partner for the United States. So in the wake of the American Revolution, he strongly encouraged repairing our relationship with Britain as quickly as possible and making that the foundation, trade with England, the foundation of our economy. Jefferson believed that American liberty was best served by an agrarian nation. Jefferson's vision is that the United States would remain a nation dominated by farmers, by yeoman farmers. That his argument, which goes back to like ancient Rome, but his argument was that yeoman farmers made the best Republicans, small r Republicans, because they were dependent on no one. They were self-sufficient. They could provide for themselves. Therefore, nobody interfered with their freedom of conscience when they went to cast their vote.
Right.
Unlike people who worked in the trades, because they were reliant on customers and suppliers, and as a result, working people have ties to them politically that farmers. So that's right off the bat. That's a huge division. Mm-hmm. They also have really different views for how the government should function. Hamilton believed in a strong central government with strong national institutions, best symbolized by his creation of the first national bank, which eventually collapsed, and then we tried a second national bank, and that all. But we tried national banking for a while, and national banking was indicative of Hamilton's views of a central government, a strong central government that wielded supremacy over the 14 states, because at this point Vermont has also joined the Union. Jefferson believes that the federal government does have power, does have a lot of power, but that the states ultimately act as a check on federal power. And the best way to strike that balance is to keep the government, the central government, as small and unobtrusive as possible. Jefferson really saw the central government's main job as foreign affairs and regulating American trade, and otherwise the rest went to the states. Jefferson was a big believer in widening the franchise. And under Jefferson, you do get a lot more white men eligible to vote. Jefferson was also a big believer in the power of public opinion, the importance of public opinion. He believed that it was the responsibility of government to be responsive to public opinion to a certain degree. Hamilton was an elitist. Hamilton, and to be fair, a lot of Hamilton's colleagues were elitists too. Hamilton's not alone in this, but Hamilton believed that only the educated and the wealthy should vote, and only the educated and the wealthy should hold office. And because they're the only ones that had a true stake in the government. Nobody else really had a stake in the nation the way the wealthy and the educated did. So that's another big division. Jefferson often described himself as a halfway pacifist. Jefferson believed that diplomacy should be absolutely exhausted before nations turn to any kind of force, largely because he saw war as a drain on the economy, which in turn required the government to tax the people, which in turn makes the central government more obtrusive in the people's lives. You only do that as an absolute last resort. Hamilton was extremely militant. From the time he was a 19-year-old student at King's College in New York City, forming a company of student volunteers to join the Continental Army. He never walked away from that, right? But what ultimately, the final severing between the two is the outbreak of the French Revolution and the way they react to it, with Jefferson believing that the United States had an obligation and a duty to support our French brothers in their quest for liberty against an oppressive government, and Hamilton arguing that we should be joining Great Britain in trying to suppress the French Revolution because it might look like the American Revolution, but in fact, Hamilton argued, it's way different and way more dangerous than the American Revolution ever was. And that's where our original political parties come from, right? That's the original division. And it starts with the bitterness between those two, but it really culminates in the election of 1800 between John Adams running for the Federalist on the Federalist ticket, because the Hamiltonians and the Federalists were basically the same thing, and Jefferson running on the Democratic Republican ticket, also known as the Jeffersonian ticket. These two men had run against each other before in 1796, with John Adams winning. And in 1800, it got particularly nasty. These two guys have been friends for ages and ages and ages, and then it all just gets. It's the first real mudslinging campaign. It's during the Jefferson camp sort of starts it when they leak to the press all the salacious details of Jefferson's affair with his young slave girl Sally Hemings, and the children he's fathered with Sally Hemings, and the fact that Sally Hemings is probably actually also his wife's half sister, making it all the more. And Jefferson responds by attacking John Adams for his monarchical attitude, for the Alien and Sedition Acts, and being no better than King George. At one point, Jefferson's camp leaked to the press the rumor that John Adams is a hermaphrodite, that he was born with both sex organs. About a month and a half before the election, the Adams camp tries to start a rumor in the press that Jefferson is actually dead and nobody should vote for him because they would just be voting for a dead guy. In some ways, the language they use is reminiscent of the language we hear today. Like, whichever one gets elected, it is the end of American democracy, right? The Adams camp arguing if Jefferson wins, he's pulling us down into all the chaos of the French Revolution, atheism, and redistribution of property and constant upheavals and bloodshed and chaos. And Jefferson arguing if Adams wins, it's going to be absolute end of democracy because he's just going to double down on the tyranny he's already he's going to lead us into a war against France that's going to cost us millions of dollars we can't afford. And then in the midst of all that tension, there's no clear-cut winner in the election of 1800 because Jefferson actually ends up accidentally tying with his vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr, and Aaron Burr refuses to recuse himself from his tie in the Electoral College. And so this ends up going to the House of Representatives to be decided, and it languishes in the House for months and months and months. The inauguration is less than 2 weeks away, and still nobody's been declared a winner in the election of 1800. And then John Adams and his supporters start saying, well, I mean, if we can't figure out which one of these two Jeffersonians, Thomas Jefferson or Aaron Burr, won the presidency, then I guess John Adams has to stay the president. And that got some people extremely angry, including the governor of Pennsylvania, Thomas McKean, who ordered out Pennsylvania's state militia and mustered them with the threat to march on Washington, D.C. and physically remove John Adams from office and in turn, the Maryland militia was called out to oppose that, not because they necessarily thought John Adams was right, but they couldn't have the Pennsylvania militia marching on Washington, D.C. People today have no idea how close we actually came to extreme violence in the election of 1800, which is also sometimes called the Revolution of 1800, because at the end of the day, what it's best remembered for is that despite how tense everything was, despite the fact that 3 states, because Virginia eventually calls out its militia as well, 3 states activating their militia, everything's really tense. In the end, the House of Representatives says Thomas Jefferson won, Adams stands down, the Federalists all peacefully leave office in Washington, D.C., and it's called the Revolution of 1800 because it was revolutionary in the peaceful transfer of power in the United States, which, France had not been able to achieve in any of its changes of parties or changes of government in the 1790s. And this is the first time the United States is switching parties. The Federalists had controlled the government from 1789 until 1800, and now the Democratic Republicans have taken over, and the Federalists just peacefully acquiesce. And the Democratic Republicans come into office, and they don't mete out any punishment on their former political adversaries either. Again, it is the full peaceful transfer of power. And that, of course, became something America has been known for. It's an imperfect record, but it is one of the traditions we try to stand by. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry, that got a little long-winded. I didn't mean to go on for quite.
That's why we're here. John Adams is, and I think I'm thinking of John as he's a little bit of an outlier when it comes to the founders, because he was an abolitionist.
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
So John Adams is an outlier in a lot of ways. You are correct about that. He was maybe the smartest of the founding fathers. I mean, I have a lot of intellectual respect for Thomas Jefferson as well, but I mean, during the American Revolution, John Adams is the workhorse of liberty, right? Like he serves on 91 different congressional committees. He throughout the entire time, unless he's traveling to Europe to try to beg Europeans to give us money to keep fighting the war, he's in Philadelphia working his tail off the entire time, just in constant public service. It's one of the things I really admire about John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams. They dedicated their lives to public service. Although many of the founding fathers did not embrace organized religion the way we often like to romanticize they did today, most of them identified as deists, including Jefferson, including Washington. Adams was a Congregationalist. His father had been a Congregationalist deacon. Adams went to Harvard initially with the idea of studying divinity, but eventually he switched to law. The Congregationalists had an interesting relationship to the abolitionist movement. It would be more fair to say Adams was anti-slavery than he was an abolitionist. His son, however, John Quincy, is often recognized as being the first national politician to have the gumption to embrace abolitionism. And the other outlier about Adams is, even though he ran on the Federalist ticket in 1796 and in 1800, he never really considered himself a Federalist. He didn't like Alexander Hamilton much more than Thomas Jefferson did. And he shared some of the same fears about Alexander Hamilton that Jefferson did. He also thought Hamilton had monarchical tendencies. He thought Hamilton had designs to try to take over as the monarch of the United States, if you will. And he just, in general, he found Adams too ambitious and too untrustworthy, and that undermined their relationship in a lot of ways. But Adams saw some sense in some of the positions that the Democratic Republicans were taking. So he didn't really try to commit himself to one specific party. And I mean, that's certainly one of the things that hurt him in the 1800 election as well. Even though he's running on the Federalist ticket, he fails to win universal Federalist support. So yeah, he is an outlier of the founding fathers in a lot of different ways. Yeah, that's a good way to describe him. He was also he was a really jealous man. It was one of his great personal flaws, although he failed to everybody else recognized it in him. He had a lot of trouble recognizing it in himself. He always, from about the age of 21, in his journals and his letters, he starts talking about his desire to be a great man, someone that will be remembered for generations. And throughout his living life, he was obsessed with the idea that everyone would remember Washington and everyone would remember Franklin, and nobody would care about old John Adams, who did so much of the work, who was a tireless public servant, and everyone was going to forget him.
Which is not true.
Not true. No, I mean
he's one of the. He's considered one of the fathers of like modern liberalism,
yes,
isn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the like people that laid out a lot of the groundwork of like philosophy that is still preeminent today. When you look at the Constitution, as they had as it was originally written, or I guess as it stands today, what are the greatest strengths and weaknesses of that document?
Sure. I mean, the separation of powers in the Constitution is a strength. Although, I mean, anyone who pays attention to the trajectory of American political history knows that the balance of powers is imperfect. I mean, you get a really strong president, and that kind of tips the scales towards the executive branch for a while. You get a really assertive Congress combined with a weak executive, and suddenly the legislative branch sort of and we've seen what activist courts can do. Whether we're talking about the John Marshall Court, the Roger Taney Court, the Warren Court, the Roberts Court, activist courts have a way of tipping the scale of the balance of powers as well. However, even though it can be tipped, there is something to be said about the arrangement of it, the way the powers are laid out, the way the prerogatives are laid out, the way each branch acts or has the ability to act as a check on the other, has largely proven to be a successful model of governance. I mean, we're coming up on 250 years, so there's something to be said. Well, I guess we've only had, I suppose, 250 years for the Constitution is a little bit further away.
Sure.
But the fact that it's a living document, I think, is a great strength of the Constitution as well. The document is meant to be adjusted and reinterpreted and reread for the societies that are living under it. And when the societies living under it find it imperfect, we have a method of changing it forever through the amendment process. And I mean, granted, we've only used it 27 times?
Yep.
27 times, and we took one of them back because temperance ended up being a terrible idea. Good in theory, terrible in practice. It is hard to get amendments passed, but we have done it. We have done it successfully, and I think it's one of the great strengths of the Constitution as well. The great weakness of the Constitution is, I mean, it's harder and harder to deny the volatility of the Electoral College system. It's antiquated, it's clunky, it allows for too much minority rule in American politics. The whole point of the Senate in the first place is to act on a check of popular rule. So the you can eliminate the Electoral College and still have the Senate act in its original function as the wisest branch of government, right? The most temperate branch of government, having that ability, and the Senate is far more conservative generally than the House of Representatives is. So like getting rid of of Electoral College wouldn't hurt that. And the damage we've seen Electoral College wrought on our system over the years, starting with the election of 1800, when we've got a tie in the Electoral College, followed by the election of 1828, when no candidate wins enough votes for the Electoral College. That event is gonna end up collapsing once and for all the so-called era of good feelings, launching us into the second party system and the age of Jacksonian democracy. 1876, which we just discussed in class, right? No clear-cut winner of the Electoral College, and the end result of that chaos is the northern states abandoning Reconstruction and letting the South instill Jim Crow and terror on African American citizens for the next 90 years. It happens again in 1888. The one who wins the popular vote does not win the Electoral College vote. In my own lifetime, we've got the 2000 election and the chaos caused by the 2000 election. We forget the Brooks Brothers riots that took place in Florida during the Florida recount over the Electoral College, but that was an attempt at a very localized disruption of the peaceful transfer of power. A number of conservative young men dressed in very nice suits rushed counting stations all across the state of Florida as they were trying to carry out a legal recount of the Gore and Bush election. And rather than letting that happen, the Brooks Brothers riots tried to disrupt that whole process. Political violence brought about solely by the imperfect function of the Electoral College system. 2016. Yep. Minority vote getter becomes the president of the United States through the function of the Electoral College. In fact, I mean, it's becoming an even more common phenomenon in politics today that the person who wins the popular vote does not win the presidential election. There's something inherently I mean, we're not a democracy. I recognize that. We're a republic
Right.
that dresses ourselves in the trappings of democracy. But
Yeah.
as a society, we have tried to move closer and closer and closer to the form of democracy by liberalizing the vote, by extending it to all white men, then extending it to all men, then extending it to men and women, then lowering the voting age, then coming up with ideas like universal mail-in voting in certain states to make sure that people get. So we've tried to move closer and closer and closer to true democracy within the Republican form, and yet we continue to allow this electoral college institute to interfere with that. It's a strange phenomenon that we still tie ourselves to it. We have the ability to pass an amendment to eradicate the electoral college once and for all, and we don't do it. And I can't wrap my head around why. And well, I guess I can, because I used to be a defender of the electoral college. So I guess I can wrap my head around why.
What is the best? What do you think the best argument is for keeping it around?
The best argument for keeping it around is, at its heart, the Electoral College is supposed to act as a check on tyranny. If the American people do something unconscionable and elect a psychopath as president, the Electoral College is supposed to step in and say, no, we're not putting that person in office. That is not happening. However, I don't think we've ever elected it. I mean, we've elected people I don't like very much, but I'm not sure we've ever elected a real psychopath. Mm-hmm. And the days of members of the Electoral College trying to carry that process out and block people they think are uniquely unqualified for office, whether that be Andrew Jackson, whether that be nobody stood in opposition to Abraham Lincoln. The South just wouldn't put him on the ballot, but there have been presidents Kennedy, for example. There were members of the Electoral College that refused to support a Catholic for president, so they cast opposition votes to ensure that a Catholic. Of course, there weren't enough that did it, but it happened, right? Nobody does that anymore. But technically, I think it is one of the good reasons for keeping the Electoral College around. One that I hear a lot that I just have an inherent. If you get rid of the Electoral College, then the only states that the candidates will care about are California, Texas, New York, and Illinois. Okay, except in the Electoral College, don't we have a situation where for decades now, the only states that the general election candidates seem to care about are Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, right? So like
Florida sometimes,
depending on the cycle. But I don't really think if you go to a straight popular election, you could get away with only campaigning in 4 states. I think that's a recipe for disaster.
I saw, I did actually see, I wish I had pulled it up. I don't remember. I think I saw it on Substack. But I think I did see something kind of like that, where it was like if Democrats win California, New York, Texas, one other state, they win the popular vote. Republicans get all other 46 states. Democrats win like 4 or 5 and they get the popular vote.
Yeah.
I wish I'd pulled that up, and I'm not here to challenge you in this because I'm not knowledgeable enough, but it does seem like
But under a national popular vote, you wouldn't necessarily win a state, right? But voters would feel like their vote counted no matter what ultimately happened in your individual. I mean, I imagine it would be really frustrating to be a Republican in California for the last 3 decades.
Yeah, it's got to be tough.
Or a Democrat in Texas for the last 3 decades.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize like 40% of California votes Republican in every presidential election, but none of their electoral votes ever go. And ditto in Texas. In an average election cycle, like 42 to 44% of Texans vote Democrat. but all the electoral college votes. So
Right.
I can see why it can get disheartening. I mean, I lived in Kansas for 6 years, and it could get disheartening. No matter how hard you work, no matter how cogently you think you make your arguments, the state is so skewed in one direction and that problem evaporates with a national popular vote to determine the president of the United States.
Sure. Going back to the Constitution, Jonathan Rauch makes a really good, I think a really like strong argument that one of the greatest strengths of the Constitution is that it's a network of implicit and implicit norms that are not always written down, and that sometimes the strength of the Constitution is not necessarily the document itself, but it comes from the idea that the citizenry is willing to uphold the unwritten rules. And that's what gives the document its strength. And that's why, and then Tim Urban, who read a book an audiobook that I really like, that I've mentioned a couple times on the show before. He said that the reason why America's history has always been the battle of a nation against itself is that there's always a tug of war between like what liberal norms or what norms in general we're willing to uphold. And that's kind of where the strength. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I mean I think that's an interesting perspective. I do agree that although the U.S. Constitution is codified, there are uncodified norms that surround our behavior regarding it, including generally the peaceful transfer of power,
Yes.
Including generally the recognition that bureaucracy is above the political fray, right? Like we've accepted for a long time, if you're a government employee, you get to vote however you want, and they're not going to fire you for it if a new administration comes into play. And because the chaos of replacing imagine if we fired half the bureaucracy every time there was a change in administration. I mean, nothing would ever get.
No.
Our bureaucracy is clunky enough as it is. Imagine if we had to retrain a new bureaucratic staff every 4 or 8 years. It would be a nightmare, right?
That would be really bad.
Yeah, I certainly agree that there is a lot to be said for the citizenry's willingness to uphold the norms of American political society. It is a great strength. I had a point I wanted to follow up to the Tim Urban thing. He said, "Oh, I know what it is." Along the same lines, I've long been a proponent of Arthur Schlesinger's pendulum theory of American history, and what Schlesinger argues is essentially very similar to what you were just describing with Urban. American political attitudes swing from the left to the right throughout the course of our history, and generally. What happens is because the American middle is so strong and has historically been so strong, it has kept the pendulum from swinging too far in American history in either one direction or the other. When American liberals push maybe too far to the left, the middle says, oh, no, let's correct and pull things back towards the center. Ditto, when the American conservative movement has pushed too far to the right, we've traditionally leaned on the center to pull things back. And so as a result, America has experienced general political stability over the course of our history. What Schlesinger argues is there are occasions in American history when the fulcrum itself at the top of the pendulum moves, right? A key one of those being as the majority of the American white population came to oppose slavery to some degree or another, more and more, it eventually caused the fulcrum to shift to the left a little bit. As Americans came to oppose communism more and more, that shifted the fulcrum to the right. as Americans came to oppose racism more and more. Well, I don't know.
Or
I have to walk back from that one.
Well, sure.
I don't know what our attitude on racism is these days. I thought we were pretty much moving towards this is a bad thing and we should try to work against it. But I don't know. It's hard to read the room these days on that issue.
And that could be considered
I feel.
Right. That could be considered like the status quo essentially shifting. Like that's the fulcrum movement.
Correct.
Like the status quo. It's like when gay marriage becomes legalized, like that's a status quo shift.
Yes,
right?
that's a great example. The way, because that's one that I've witnessed in my lifetime from, I'm old enough to remember when the AIDS crisis unfolded. Actually, my cousin died from AIDS in the initial wave of the AIDS crisis. And the fear and the paranoia and the rumor mongering surrounding the homosexual population of the United States. Everybody, I'm not trying to like dismiss or diminish anything, but it was so common, Carson. Like in Boy Scouts, on a regular basis, we would end our meetings with a game called Smear the Queer, and like we never thought anything about it, right? We're Boy Scouts, we're trustworthy, we're loyal, helpful, we're like we're supposed to be model citizens, but we're on The Office, Michael Scott, not that someone should be admired, but he makes the point. He's like, when I was a kid, the word gay meant weird, and it's like, and then to see over the course of the last 20 years, the way our attitudes, our language, our legal structures have all become so much more open-minded and so much more accepting. I know there's still opposition out there. I'm not trying to diminish.
Sure.
There are people who still struggle. There are places in this country where people still face oppression. But in general, the way American society has just done a complete 180 on this issue since the time I was like 10 to where I am now, 35 years later. It's really, that's a great example of a fulcrum shift or a status quo shift. Yeah.
I want to go back to the pendulum thing later on, but for now, let's jump ahead a little bit. Looking at the 1850s, what are...
Yes, so just to be clear, the 1850s and 1860s are the most divisive time in American history.
Right.
I know we feel a lot of negative feelings about what's going on these days, and I don't like when we describe our fellow countrymen as enemies. That is disconcerting language, but I promise you it was worse in the 1850s and 1860s.
Yes.
We killed each other on a tremendous scale over our divisions then. So
yes. What are some of the main reasons why the Civil War break out, and what are some of the big misconceptions about that? A lot of the talk is that this was over. This was a war for the end of slavery, or that it was economic reasons, or it was the expansion of territory. What are we looking at there?
Sure. So obviously, the easy answer is slavery.
Yeah.
What was the Civil War about? It was about slavery. But as I emphasized to all my students in like the first week of class, there is no event in history that can be reduced to a single cause, right? If the Civil War is just about slavery, why didn't we fight it in 1783 or 1800, right? Or 1830? It was never universally accepted as being normal and okay in America. Like anyone who tells you that, oh, well, they practiced slavery because they didn't know any better. They practiced slavery because it was normal. They practiced slavery because everybody accepted it. No, that's simply not true. First of all, from the very beginning, there's a clear-cut group of individuals who were like, this is messed up. Obviously, the slaves knew from the very beginning that slavery was wrong, right? But Quakers become an outspoken group against the institution of slavery. There are pockets of resistance. Some Puritans embraced slavery, but a lot of Puritans believed that it was a sin and a horrible thing and should be done away with. So slavery was always a divisive issue in this country. From the colonial era all the way through to the Civil War. But what makes the Civil War, what makes slavery during the Civil War era different? There are a few different factors at play here, but probably the biggest one is westward expansion. For a very long time, after the American Revolution, the United States borders are set, right? The American Revolution grants the United States all the territory east of the Mississippi River, south of the St. Lawrence River, and north of Florida. So there's not a ton of room for the United States. I mean, I guess it felt like a ton of room in 1783, but we run out of that space. But the point remains, with the Northwest Ordinance of 1789 that establishes the Ohio River as the north-south division of the slave territory and the free territory, and the Mississippi River acting as the western extremity of the United States, it's very clear during that part of American history that slavery only has so far to expand. It can't go north of the Ohio, it can't go west of the Mississippi, and that's going to be it. That's the borders on slavery. And Northerners, although they didn't love it, they could live with that because starting around 1790, the key American conviction regarding slavery was that once it stops expanding, it will start to die out because when there are no new markets to bring the slave trade into, the value of slaves in the South will start to deteriorate, and it will eventually become more economical for them to be free laborers than slave laborers. So many Northerners who didn't like slavery felt like they could accept it because they knew the end was in sight. Well, then things start to happen. Thomas Jefferson acquires the Louisiana Territory, which more than almost doubles the size of the United States. Then Texas fights its war for independence, but most of the Texans fighting in the war for independence are actually American slaveholders from the South. The war for Texas independence was a war over slavery, right? Tejas, when Mexico won its independence, it abolished slavery. The Mexican government wanted to grow the northern state of Tejas as much as possible, so they offered free land to anyone who would move to Tejas. They had certain rules they had to abide by. They couldn't plant cotton. They couldn't bring slaves. They had to convert to Catholicism. Tons of Americans come pouring into Tejas. But the central government in Mexico City was pretty weak during that time, and it wasn't paying that much attention to what was actually going on in Tejas. And these Americans were bringing slaves with them, and they were planting cotton almost exclusively. Well, when Santa Anna ends up becoming the president general of Texas, he brings a lot of central government competency with him. He actually was a pretty mediocre general, but he was a good government organizer, and he makes it clear to Tejas, hey, you guys are breaking all of our constitutional rules. You have a choice. You can either stop growing cotton and free your slaves, or I'm going to march the army up there and we're going to do it for you. And in response to that, Texas rises up and declares its independence, right? Which it wins with the help of a lot of Americans who decide to go fight in Texas. And then we eventually annex Texas. And all of this this Western expansion, it becomes more and more problematic. And Northerners continue to be like, okay, well, I guess we'll let it exist in Louisiana because it had already existed in Louisiana. I guess we'll let it exist in Texas because it was already there when we annexed Texas. And then we get the Missouri Compromise, which tries to set the southern border of Missouri as the future north-south divider on slavery. But slaveholders start to argue that the territories are commonly held by all the American people, and to keep them and their slave property out of the territories is unconstitutional. It's a violation of their property rights under the 7th Amendment. It's a violation of their rights under the legislative branch. and it just gets more and more and more tense. And the first, huge outbreak of violence over this issue ends up coming in Kansas territory, because the federal government decides to test a policy known as popular sovereignty. Let the people living in the territory decide for themselves as they write their territorial constitution whether they'll be a slave territory or a free territory. Well, that just became a disaster, because as soon as it became a contest of votes, abolitionists purposely moved to Kansas to try to increase the abolitionist vote. Meanwhile, groups of men known as border ruffians from Arkansas and Missouri, who don't actually live in Kansas but want to see Kansas become a slave territory, they come pouring over the border to vote illegally, to intimidate others away from the polls. The elections are just a complete mess. There's no clear-cut winner. You end up having two competing territorial governments in Kansas, one in Lecompton and one in Lawrence, or Topeka rather, and eventually these people go to war against one another, and they kill each other the numbers of bleeding Kansas have always been hard to track, but a lot of historians argue the Civil War doesn't actually begin in 1861. It begins in 1856 in Kansas. And then the violence just moves east. Because it doesn't stop in Kansas, right? Things calm down. It moves in peaks and valleys. And after John Brown leaves Kansas in 1858. 1858, December 1858, somewhere around there. Once he leaves Kansas, he was the most militant of the abolitionist fighters in Kansas. Things do calm down a bit after John Brown leaves, but it never stops. And then the Civil War breaks out, and they just take Confederate or Union sides, and they keep killing each other in Kansas for 4 more years. Yeah. Did that get to the point? I think.
I think so. Yeah.
I would say
great.
Western expansion more so. It is true that the North embraced industrialism more. The northern population. We don't want to overstress this, right? We don't want to make it seem like the North has completely turned in the Second Industrial Revolution, because that doesn't really start to unfold until after the Civil War. The northern states, the free states, were still majority agrarian states. Half of all men in the free states listed their occupation as farmer. The rural population in the free states still far outnumbered the urban population in the free states. In the free states. But 90% of American factories were also in the free states. 90% of American manufacturing was in the free states. That all of that is 90% of the railroad tracks were in the free states. 90% of the telegraph lines were in the free states. The free states were embracing modernization in a way that the slave states were not. And part of that is because of slavery, right? When you tie yourself to a cash crop slave system, modernization is a threat to that structure you've established.
Yeah.
But the South also, again, slavery is to blame for this, but as immigrant waves are arriving in the United States, as they're bringing with them work ethic and ambition and dreams and innovation, they're not going to the slave states, because there's no work for them there, because all the work in the slave states are done by the slaves or by the poor whites who already live there. So they're going to the North where there's opportunity, and that ends up skewing the population numbers pretty significantly, because by the outbreak of the Civil War, the population of the free states is 23 million compared to the population of the slave states at about 13 million. But 4.5 million of that 13 million are the slaves.
The slaves, yeah.
So,
yeah.
So it's, yes, it is modernization versus agrarianism to some degree, but I'm always really reluctant to overstress that. It's much more the rising tensions caused by the question of Western expansion. Can we allow slavery to continue to expand? And even though most Northerners did not view themselves as abolitionists at all, they did view themselves as anti-slavery enough that their answer increasingly became no. We have to stop letting this institution grow.
Yeah. Now, during the war, so your dissertation was a reevaluation of the Battle of Gettysburg.
My master's thesis.
Master's thesis.
My
That's what it
master's
was. Okay,
thesis,
my
yes.
mistake. Can you talk about the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg?
Oh, sure. I mean, it is one of the single most significant battles of the American Civil War. Historians are often reluctant to be like, this was a turning point, right? Because there's so many turning. Isn't Antietam a turning point?
Yeah, I was
Isn't
going to say that.
Chancellorsville? Isn't Vicksburg, right?
Sure.
Turning points can be a tricky thing, but what Gettysburg does represent is the high tide of the Confederacy, right? After Gettysburg, the Confederacy never has the same kind of strength, never has the same kind of. I mean, they're on the defensive for almost the rest of the war from Gettysburg on. So Gettysburg, besides being the high tide of the Confederacy, is also the deadliest and bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. Antietam was a terrible day, but it was a day. Gettysburg unfolded over July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863, and at the end of the battle, there were more than 56,000 casualties between the two sides. So Lee wins this victory in the spring of 1863 called Chancellorsville. The Union forces in the East had gone into the spring campaign really full of hope and optimism and vigor. They were under a command of a new general, a guy named Joseph Hooker, who throughout the winter months had done a lot to reorganize the army, reinvigorate it, try to get their morale back up after a really dark end to the war in 1862, and people really responded to Hooker and his efforts to revitalize. Hooker also, he had been a really good corps commander before he became the army commander. He had developed a reputation. His nickname was Fightin' Joe. So people were really hopeful that he would come in, and not only would he rejuvenate the attitude of the army, but he would bring an aggression to the Eastern War that was badly needed, because the South had really been the aggressors in the East. From the beginning, 1861, throughout the first year of the war, throughout 1862, and now we're in 1863, and Northerners want to see a change in that, and they think Joe Hooker's going to do that. So Hooker has a really good spring campaign. He has a really good plan for his spring campaign, I should say, but he gets timid. Right when he should be bold, he gets timid at a place called Chancellorsville, Virginia, and in that moment, Lee seizes the initiative and unleashes a devastating surprise attack on Hooker and the United States Army of the Potomac. Although the Union forces actually fought a lot better at Chancellorsville than they're given credit for, and most people realize, at the end of the 3-day battle, Hooker orders his men to retreat across the Rappahannock River, and it leads to a great demoralization in the Union Army. Meanwhile, Lee believes he has won a really key victory. Even though Stonewall Jackson is dead and he's lost probably his single most trusted subordinate, Lee believes that he has just dealt a devastating blow to the Army of the Potomac. Which, maybe he should have thought about that a little bit more. The reality is Lee lost a greater portion of his men at Chancellorsville than the Army of the Potomac did. And the Army of the Potomac had the ability to replace the men that they lost a lot better than Lee did. But Lee felt like he had just dealt a really devastating blow to the Army of the Potomac, and the time was right to try a second northern invasion. He had tried a northern invasion before in the fall of 1862, and he's turned back at Antietam, Maryland. But this time he doesn't want a border state. He wants to invade a northern state itself. So Lee takes off for Pennsylvania with the intention of wreaking havoc as much as possible in south central Pennsylvania, acquiring as many supplies for his army as he can. He orders his men to round up any free blacks and take them to the south as slaves. Anybody that wants to tell you that Robert E. Lee was anti-slavery doesn't know Robert E. Lee very well at all. And he's being very effective, right? Especially because Hooker is very slow to follow him. Hooker doesn't want to follow Lee into Pennsylvania. Hooker's like, President Lincoln, I can attack Richmond right now. And Lincoln's like, Hooker, I don't care. Like, there is an army marching in Pennsylvania. They could be going to Pittsburgh. They could be going to Philly. They could be coming for D.C. I don't know. I don't care about Richmond. Get up here. And so eventually Hooker does follow Lee, but he complains and he moans and whines the whole time, and Lincoln's getting more and more and more frustrated. And then Hooker says to President Lincoln, well, there's 12,000 men stationed in Harper's Ferry. I need those men in my army. And Lincoln says, no, I need those men to guard Harper's Ferry. It's a really important railroad junction.
Yeah.
And Hooker says, and this is June 28th, 1863. The battle breaks out on July 1st, 1863. Yep. Hooker says, if you don't give me those men at Harper's Ferry, I'm going to resign. And Lincoln says, okay, I accept your resignation. And so now the biggest army in the United States is without a commanding general, and nobody knows it, but we're 48 hours away from the single biggest battle of the entire war. The story is that Lincoln first offered command to the leader of the First Corps of the Army of the Potomac, a Pennsylvanian by the name of John Reynolds. But Reynolds turned it down. And he next turned to the commander of, now I can't remember what corps George Meade commanded before.
I was going to say, wasn't Meade a general?
Yes, Meade was a corps general. He was a corps commander as well. And he was also from Pennsylvania.
Yep.
It's funny, before the war, he was a lighthouse designer. He worked.
What an occupation!
Yeah, well, he worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and actually, there are still some of his lighthouses up in. I mean, the Cape May Lighthouse in Cape May, New Jersey, is probably the most famous one that he designed and oversaw the construction of. But yeah, it's still there. Anyway, Meade takes command of the Army of the Potomac on June 29th, and right away, Meade's like, okay, I don't want to fight in Pennsylvania. What I want to do is establish a line of battle in a place called Rock Creek, Maryland. And there's no way Lee can march back into the South without attacking me at Rock Creek. So I'm going to send some cavalry forces into Pennsylvania to keep an eye on what Lee is doing, but I'm going to keep most of my army in Maryland. Meanwhile, Lee is running around Pennsylvania, and what he's hoping to do is draw the Army of the Potomac all the way to Cashtown, PA, and then fight a defensive battle. He wants to fight on the defensive and make the Army of the Potomac attack him at Cashtown. Well, instead, what ends up happening is late on June 30th, 1863, a man by the name of John Buford rides into Gettysburg with his 3,000-man cavalry brigade of Union soldiers, and he looks around at the heights south of Gettysburg, in what today we know as Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Little Round Top, and Big Round Top. Yep. And he immediately says, if the Confederates get that position, we're going to have to attack them there and they will destroy us. And so he makes the immediate decision to hold Gettysburg against any Confederate forces that might try to come into town. And sure enough, there is a brigade of Confederate soldiers just a few miles outside of Gettysburg that have a plan to march into the town on the 1st to look for supplies. Buford learns that the Confederates are planning on coming in the morning, and he moves his entire force out to the plains north of Gettysburg to defend the town from any Confederate soldiers coming in. And then he sends message back to John Reynolds with the 1st Corps, Oliver Otis Howard with the 11th Corps, and General Meade. And he says, I know you didn't want to fight here, but I think this is where we have to fight. The 1st and 11th Corps have to come support me as quickly as possible. And then shortly after dawn on July 1st, Buford's pickets exchanged the first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg with pickets from Henry Heath's brigade. The battle unfolds slowly on the 1st because, again, neither commanding general wanted it there. Neither one was prepared to fight there. So neither of them are poised to get a whole bunch of troops there immediately. So the way the battle develops is throughout the course of the day, Lee will send in troops piecemeal, and then Union troops will show up piecemeal. John Reynolds does get there with the 1st Corps, and then John Reynolds is almost immediately killed. He's shot in the head by a Confederate sharpshooter and dies in his saddle. Abner Doubleday becomes the commander of the 1st Corps from that point forward. More of Lee's troops come, and Lee commits more and more men from his 2nd Corps under the command of A.P. Hill. Then elements from Ewell's Corps start showing up. Richard Ewell. So after Stonewall Jackson died, Lee. I'm too deep in the weeds now. Let me back. I'm getting way.
It's okay. When's the last time you've been to Gettysburg?
I go every year, at least
Nice.
once.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So
Yeah.
I was there in November of last year. At the very least, I go every year for Remembrance Day,
Right.
which is the celebration of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and the commitment of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. My brothers and my dad and I used to always go out, and my brothers and I have kept that tradition alive even after.
Nice.
And now we take my son and my youngest brother's oldest comes with us. And then I have another nephew who's 5 that will probably he will come with us eventually,
Sure.
but 5 is a little too young. 5 is a little too young.
The first time I was there was in 8th grade, and I was really into history back then, but I don't think even at that age you can quite grasp
Yep.
what you're looking at. And then we were there in 2023. We were there 2 summers ago now.
Oh, okay.
For a conference with Braver Angels, which is an organization that we've mentioned a lot on the show. They're the largest cross-partisan movement dedicated to political depolarization.
Oh, good. Yeah.
So every year their convention is held in a place that had a lot of civil unrest, and the idea is we go there to heal division. So
That's good.
we were there in 2023, and I think then I got a lot more of a deeper appreciation of like really what had happened
Yeah.
in that space, and like what the severity of what that was is not something that I was really able to grasp as an 8th grader. But now I was 20
Yeah.
whenever we went, and it was just a deeper appreciation for what that space was. It's
So many American kids are made to memorize the Gettysburg Address, but they never go to Gettysburg.
No.
They never really feel the weight of those words until you're there. And then you really understand what Lincoln was talking about when he talks about the last full measure of devotion. And these men have consecrated this ground far more than we ever can with our... And then what we owe to them for the sacrifice that they've made, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's a beautiful and a tragic thing at the same time.
I mean, it's a beautiful area.
Oh gosh,
Gettysburg's beautiful. But it feels.
I love Gettysburg. I've been there again, probably more than anywhere else in my life that I haven't lived. I've been.
Right.
but it is a little developed, right?
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
because it was always a town. Antietam, if you've never been to the Antietam battlefield,
I've never been to Antietam.
It is also beautiful, but it is like amazingly well preserved.
Gotcha.
Amazingly well preserved. That's not a knock on Gettysburg. I love Gettysburg.
The downtown area was, it had been developed.
Yeah, it has to. I mean, towns have to grow.
We were on Gettysburg College. That's where the convention
nice
was.
campus.
It's a very nice campus. Yeah. It's a place that feels oddly haunted.
Yes.
But in a weird way. It's like it's not necessarily in like a bad way, although a horrible thing happened there. But it's just I would like to go back. I need to make an effort to get back up there at some point.
No, I highly recommend. I mean, it's such an amazing place. I got to do a Gettysburg staff ride once with West Point. That was really was an amazing opportunity. Yeah.
Yeah. We met a guy. I met a guy at the Brave Angels convention. It was in Kenosha this year. But I met a guy that was he's a tour guide at Gettysburg. Like he does regular tours. And I forget his name. I wish I remembered. But yeah, I wonder if have you ever done tours up there? Or do you kind of...
Well, I mean, I'm usually a tour guide up there more than...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that would make sense, right? It would be...
I know it pretty well. I know.
Right.
In case you didn't... From the little nerd tangent I went on before I realized how nerdy I was being. Listeners are like, what is he talking about?
I love
Richard Ewell?
Yeah. What is the historical significance of Pittsburgh during the war?
During the Civil War?
Yes.
During the Civil War, all the supplies for the Western armies during the Civil War came from here and floated downriver to get to Ulysses S. Grant, to get to him, Tecumseh Sherman, to feed the entire war effort. That in and of itself is a pretty significant function within. I mean, Pittsburgh had already embraced railroads and the steel industry before the Civil War, but the Civil War is really what explodes Pittsburgh as one of, if not the beating heart of the Second Industrial Revolution in the United States, which, as we discussed in class, although sometimes referred to as the technological revolution, around here we more commonly call it the steel revolution because of how important steel was to driving the second industrial revolution. But even before the war breaks out, Pittsburgh has an important role in all of this. The Republican Party is only born after the American Whig Party collapses in the wake of the 1852 election, and it's officially born in Wisconsin in 1854, and the party grows pretty rapidly. I mean, there's a lot of people looking for something like the Republican Party in the 1850s. Although many Democrats and Southerners called it the abolitionist party, and abolitionists did gravitate towards the Republican Party, the Republican Party's platform didn't advocate abolitionism. Instead, it advocated the end of the Western expansion of slavery. It was a anti-slavery party, not an abolitionist party. It was also a very pro-business party as well from its very foundation, and that foundation is laid in Pittsburgh. The first national convention of the Republican Party is held in Pittsburgh in 1856, and that's where they articulate their platform for the American people for the first time. It's also where they'll pick their first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, who they ran more because he was a very popular person than because of his astute political abilities. And then, I mean, during the war, New York provides the most volunteers to the United States war effort. Pennsylvania supplies the second most volunteers to the United States war effort, with many of them coming from Philly because Philly was a bigger city. But Pittsburgh contributed thousands and thousands and thousands of men to the Union war effort as well. So another function of Pittsburgh is just the sheer sheer number of volunteers that came out of Allegheny County in order to help put down the Southern Rebellion and eventually abolish slaves as well.
I don't know if this is a can of worms that we should open here and now, but this has been a thing that I've been trying to figure out for a long time. Are you familiar with the theory of the Great Switch?
Of the parties?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that real?
Yes.
Okay.
But it's not just the simple flipping of a switch, right?
Okay.
It doesn't just happen. It unfolds over a couple of generations, to be perfectly honest with you.
Okay. And when does that start?
Well, the populist movement plays a role in all this. The Democratic and Republican parties were clearly different in the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s. But as the Gilded Age progresses, the Democrats and Republicans come to look more and more and more alike in the 1880s and 1890s. And in response to that, you have what is known as the Populist Party emerge on the scene, arguing as a third party in politics that neither party is actually adhering to what the American people want, and the Populist Party is going to respond. I mean, we all know what populism is. This is a party dedicated. This is what you want, American people. We're going to give it to you.
Yeah.
The movement grows it grows wildly enough that both parties have to start responding to it beginning in the 1896 election cycle. The Democrats basically nominate a populist in William Jennings Bryan, and the Republicans' candidate of William McKinley, has to try to respond to that by embracing his own populist message. So both parties, because of the populist movement and the progressive movement, are forced to start redefining themselves. But it won't really be until the Great Depression and the rise of FDR and New Deal democracy that the switch really starts to take hold.
Okay.
The New Deal it drastically changes the American political landscape, and it pushes Democrats into such a position of political strength throughout the 1930s and 1940s that Republicans they have no choice but to react to what is happening with the Democrats, and the reaction is not to try to emulate, but to try to define themselves by being the polar opposite of what the New Deal Democrats were.
Okay.
Although I will say the one through line that the Republican Party never walked away from was their commitment to American business. Right? That is something that connects the Republican Party from its inception all the way through until today.
So I've unintentionally gone a little bit out of order there, historically
That's okay.
speaking. But okay, so I just wanted to clear that up because I've heard so much back and forth, not as much recently, but a couple of years ago, I'd heard so much back and forth about, like, was this real? Was this not? Did it happen?
Yep.
Did it not?
Well, so the final element is Nixon, right?
Mm-hmm.
During New Deal politics, although FDR and many Northern Democrats are deeply opposed to the way the South is running their affairs, the South was known as the Solid South for a reason, right? They started voting Democrat in the 1870s, and they never stopped voting Democrat. And FDR wanted really hard to keep Southern Democrats in the fold, believing that he could eventually transform them from within. Of course, the fact that it was impossible to get an anti-lynching bill passed through Congress during any of the New Deal years should have been a clear indicator. But so the final switch is when Republicans start adopting the Southern strategy, best symbolized by Nixon, and a key part of the Southern strategy was race baiting, and that's the final element in the party switch because African Americans stayed Republican voters for a long time, and it wasn't really. African Americans did not thrive under the New Deal the way they should. So they didn't necessarily become loyal, staid Democratic voters during the Great Depression and during the New Deal. And because the Democratic Party was so closely aligned with the American South, and the majority of the African American population was in this, it's not really. Kennedy is where that switch starts, right?
Okay.
Kennedy does not get endorsed by Martin Luther King Jr., but he does get endorsed by Martin Luther King Sr. And the Kennedys make certain promises about their attitudes towards the civil rights and how it's going to be far more progressive than Eisenhower's. And the Kennedys, their record on it, I mean, it's okay. I mean,
Sure.
But LBJ, if LBJ doesn't fall into the Vietnam quagmire and dedicate himself, if we don't associate himself so much with the Vietnam disaster, I think we might remember LBJ as one of the great civil rights presidents. Mm-hmm. He wasn't perfect, but under LBJ, more civil rights legislation makes it through Congress and is voted and signed into law than at any time since Reconstruction, since radical Reconstruction. I mean, there's something to be said for that.
Sure. I do want to. We're going to get to the Vietnam in a bit here. Sorry, folks, for unintentionally jumping the gun there, going ahead a couple decades, but I want to go back to the Civil War for a bit. How does history remember Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee?
Good. So, Lee, we'll start with Lee.
Sure.
Because he has a cult in a way that nobody else, except maybe for Lincoln, does from the Civil War. Mm-hmm. This cult of Lee really starts to develop in the 1870s when the lost cause mythology arises for the first time. To be clear, at the outbreak of the Civil War and during most of the Civil War, Southerners were pretty forthright about the importance of slavery as a driving force behind their rebellion. It's only in the wake of the Civil War that they start embracing this lost cause idea as it comes. Oh, it's called the lost cause because a book is published called The Lost Cause, right? Mm. That argues it wasn't really about slavery. It was about maintaining a beautiful culture, a beautiful society predicated on a chivalrous way of life. Southern men fought with bravery and honor, and they shouldn't be denigrated for standing up for the cause that they believed in.
Which was owning slaves.
Well, no, it was liberty. It was liberty.
Right.
Their freedoms as Americans to be property owners free from the tyranny of government, to live their lives how they chose, not how the federal government dictated to them.
It sounds like a skit from The Onion in like the early 2000s. Like this sounds like an Onion skit.
Yeah, I mean it's there is something about the lost cause that if you're willing to set aside some really glaringly obvious flaws in the argument, it's easy to embrace the romanticism of it, right?
Sure.
There is something chivalric about the warriors of the South on their.
Sure.
You think of George Pickett, or you think of Jeb Stuart with his ostrich feather in his hat, and George Pickett always smelling like cologne. And I mean, they did view themselves as the progeny of the old chivalrous knights of Europe, right? And there is something captivating about the old plantation homes. They're beautiful. The
Sure.
architecture, the views and the vistas. And if you choose to ignore all the ugliness that underlies that facade of chivalry, it's really easy to get wrapped up in the lost cause and to believe. And there are ways you can job the statistics too, to be like, well, if it's about slavery, 75% of Southerners never owned a slave. So how do you explain that? Okay.
That's a bit of a lousy argument.
People can use statistics to manipulate, and if you're not well versed enough in Southern society to understand how even non-slaveholders often felt like they had an active stake in slavery, you don't have a good answer for that. You're like, oh gosh, you're right. Why would so many men who never owned slavery fight for slavery? It doesn't make any sense. They must have been fighting for something else. So yeah, you can get caught up in it. But Lee's role in all of this is that he really feeds lost cause culture as well, because he doesn't write or speak a lot in the wake of the American Civil War, but he refuses to ever really acknowledge that he was beaten by Grant, right? Like, his whole argument is they had more men, they had more material, and that's why they won the war. Well, no, I mean, they won the war because they had better leadership, because they had greater commitment behind the cause they were fighting for, because there was no such thing as Confederate nationalism, but there was such a thing as American nationalism that stirred in the hearts of men, right? Desertion numbers in the Confederate Army are way higher than desertion numbers in the Union Army. There's all kinds of reasons why the South lost, and very low on that list is the simple explanation that, the North had more men.
Sure.
Bigger armies lose to smaller armies all the time. And Lee just becomes more and more and more romanticized the further away we move from the war. And part of it is because the stories that get told about him, things like, well, did you know he actually was opposed to slavery? Again, it's a myth that if you know Robert E. Lee, you know that's a myth. But technically, it is true he didn't actually own any slaves. His father died when he was very young, and his family was fairly broke. He married into a family that had a tremendous number of slaves that he never technically owned, but he was the overseer of, he was the master of, he was the director of their fates.
In class, didn't you say that his father's will,
his father-in-law's will
was to free all of their slaves,
and he wouldn't do it. He refused to do it. That's exactly right.
Yep.
In both the invasion of Maryland and the invasion of Pennsylvania, he gives specific orders to round up any free blacks and bring them south as slaves. But we buy the myth that he was we buy the myth that he was reluctant to leave the Union, right? This one is maybe a little more complicated. There was part of Lee that was like, gosh, I did swear this oath to the Constitution of the United States. Right. But as soon as his home state of Virginia seceded from the Union, he was out the door. He was never staying in it wasn't a hesitation. There wasn't a moral struggle.
He had more of a loyalty to his home state than he did to the preservation of the Union, essentially.
Yes. And then his military record gets drastically overinflated as well. Lee was a brilliant tactician, which means he knew how to execute a battle really well. He was a terrible strategist. He had no clear, from the very beginning, even before he's the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, he is Jefferson Davis's chief military advisor. And from the very beginning, he has no clear vision on how to win this war. He has no, and this is part of his Virginia obsession. His whole obsession during the entire war is Virginia, 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 as if there isn't a mass rebellion that he's supposed to be in charge of defending. terrible strategy. And even as a tactician, I mean, Lee is a very, very aggressive commander, attacking again and again and again and again. There's this great book called Attack and Die that essentially argues Lee bleeds his own side to death through his constant aggressive approach to warfare. Instead of sitting back and making Union forces attack him, he's attacking again and again and again, inflicting casualties on his own side that they cannot afford to lose. That's not good strategy, right?
Sure. So he's the guy that if you give him the plan, he can execute it really well, but he cannot come up with the plan.
I believe that is correct, yes.
Sure.
Whereas Grant is almost and even though we're all these years removed from the war, people still continue to believe these myths about and then the final myth, I guess, about Robert E. Lee is that at the end of the war, he goes back and he lives in peace and he doesn't do anything to encourage former Confederates to resist. But that's not true either, right? He doesn't explicitly say resist the rules that Reconstruction is trying to impose on you, but he also never says to his veterans, hey, we lost. You need to embrace the fact that we lost, and we need to adjust our society. He is very much part of the tacit resistance to Reconstruction that unfolds. But again, it's something that we romanticize about him. We make it seem like he went off into retirement and surrender peacefully and happily as a college president, but that's not really the truth. Grant's reputation is finally being repaired. I mean, in the wake of the war, people love Grant, and then from like 1880 until, I don't know, 2000, people are like, Grant was just lucky. Grant was an idiot. Grant this, Grant that. Grant was a drunk. Grant didn't know what Grant just had more men. Grant just had more weapons. Grant was just a sledgehammer.
Did he smoke 100 cigars a day?
Well, okay, so yes, Grant might have had an addictive personality.
Those are impressive. I don't care what anybody is. Those are impressive numbers.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's something. It's something.
Consume of 100 anything a day.
During the war, in his wagon train, there were literally barrels that held nothing but General Grant's cigars. So Grant did identify as an alcoholic. That's true. Grant developed a major drinking problem after the Mexican-American War. He was stationed in Fort Humboldt, California, which was like in the middle of nowhere, Northern California. He was denied permission to bring his wife and his kid with him. And there was nothing to do out there but ride horses, play cards, and drink. And that's what they all did. But Grant grew closer and closer. Drinking wasn't just an event during cards for Grant, right? And eventually, the drinking became such a problem that his commanding officer pulled him aside, and he was like, Ulysses, I either have to fire you or I can let you quietly resign. But one way or the other, you're out of the Army. Like, you can resign or I can get you a dishonorable discharge, but your drinking is too problematic. So Grant resigns rather than be discharged, comes back east. He's broke. He has nothing. His father-in-law tries to start him as a farmer. He's a terrible farmer, fails at farming, tries to be a debt collector, but he's too tender-hearted. He won't actually make anybody pay any debts, so he fails as a debt collector. His family is growing bigger as he lives in St. Louis, and he realizes that he can't keep drinking. And Grant quits the bottle once he moves back to St. Louis. And there is no credible evidence that Grant ever drank again after returning from Fort Humboldt, California. There's one story from somebody on his staff that claimed in the wake of Union victory in the war, he saw Grant drink himself stupid. Eli Parker claimed this. He's the only person who claimed it, and the evidence for it is scant. But if Grant ever drank again, maybe he indulged one time after Lee surrendered at Appomattox. But the idea that Grant was a raging alcoholic through the war is nonsense. But he did replace his drinking addiction with a severe cigar smoking addiction.
Sometimes you got to replace it with something.
So you got to replace it with something. Actually, I mean, you got to replace it with something.
And that is what eventually killed him.
That is what he died of throat cancer.
Yeah.
Yep. He was a grand strategist. He really was.
Mm-hmm.
Grant knew exactly how to win the war, and executing that strategy of Grant's is how the war was won.
Yep.
The United States has the manpower advantage. Let's use it to our advantage. We need to bring pressure against the Confederacy simultaneously from multiple points at once. We're going to invade Virginia. We're going to invade Georgia. We're going to invade Texas. We're going to invade Alabama. We're going to invade North Carolina. We're going to do it all at once, all at the same time, compounding pressure all across the South. And the other thing that was really genius about Grant's strategy was his growing conviction that you could not defeat the rebellion without making the Southern population feel the cost of war. And so Grant introduced what was known as the hard hand of war into the American Civil War. Nobody carried it out better than Sherman, but it was Grant's idea. Like, it's not just enough to defeat their armies. We have to defeat their entire will to resist. And so starting in 1863 and then carrying out throughout 1864, 1865, destroy, right? Burn it.
Cities, entire cities.
So the Confederates actually burned Atlanta themselves, and the Confederates burned Columbia, South Carolina themselves. Grant subscribed to much more targeted destruction. Destroy their cotton fields, destroy their silos, destroy their railroads, destroy their factories. Leave the population enough food that they're not going to starve to death. His intention wasn't to cause mass famine, but it was to destroy the ability of the South to resist at all. So it was more targeted than we often give it credit for.
So it's just targeting key infrastructure, essentially.
Key infrastructure, and the wealth structure of the ruling class as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So what would that look like? Like, was he going after banks and stuff like that? That might be a silly question, but it's going after the wealth. Obviously, you're going after cotton fields, you're going railroads because those are big industries that produced a lot of money. Is he ever specifically what other things? Well,
what was the largest wealth holding of the South? Their highest property value was invested in what?
Oh,
their $4.5 million.
Oh, the slaves, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
With the Emancipation Proclamation, these were also armies of liberation, and that was made. Grant made that clear. Like, hey, take them in as contraband, do whatever you have to, but their slaves are no longer slaves; they're free. That's where Sherman's land redistribution comes from, right? Attack the wealth of the ruling class, take their land, give it to their slaves. It was not uncommon to sack plantation homes and pull direct wealth out of plantation homes as well. Again, they targeted the ruling class far more than they did the working class of the South. But banks were tricky because they went broke pretty quick across the South.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of a silly question. I was just thinking, do you ever targeting actual financial institutions? Yep. But I guess they were already broke by that point. So Grant has a much better reputation now than
it's repairing. I still think
now this is among the historical community,
but also writ large as well. Yes, I think both among historians and among the general populace, people still revere Lee more than Grant, which is crazy because Grant saved the Union. He helped free the slaves. He was a firm civil rights leader during Reconstruction. He destroyed the first Ku Klux Klan. Grant did great things, but somehow Lee is still viewed as a greater American hero than Ulysses S. Grant is. But we're getting there. I mean, the change is it is unfolding. It continues to unfold. It's happening. One of them has a statue in the Capitol and one doesn't, so there's something to be said for that. Grant's statue sits beautifully in front of the U.S. Capitol, although the reflecting pool, last time I was down there, which granted was a few years ago, badly needed cleaned up.
Sure.
But at least Lee doesn't have a statue in our Capitol.
That wouldn't be great.
He does have one at West Point, which is weird.
That's a conversation for another time. That's a conversation for West Point. Well, why did Reconstruction fail? What are some of the reasons why it failed?
First and foremost, it failed because the defeated Confederates refused to accept their defeat. And they demonstrated that refusal through violent uprisings against the government, but even more so against the freedmen. The defeated again, this is not all defeat. There were some Confederates that accepted their loss and believed that a new way forward was needed for the South, but too many of them subscribed to the idea that it was imperative things remain as much the same as they possibly could. The same power structures, the same social structures, the same labor structures, and they were willing to use deadly terroristic violence to see that happen. For a long time, white Northerners were not okay with the exercise of that violence, but a series of events in the 1870s undermine Northern white support for Reconstruction. The corruption in the Grant administration, which is, although I often will defend Grant personally, he did allow way too much shady stuff under his watch.
It's
way too much.
It's almost hilarious. Like,
it is.
How much money?
How do you let your Secretary of Navy embezzle $15 million and then never hold him responsible for it? It's crazy.
I don't know. In class, I always, on the laptop, while you're talking, I always just try to pull up like a calculator to see how much money it is today because I'm always curious.
Yep.
And it's always just like hundreds of millions of dollars.
It's an astronomical number. Yeah.
It's like if that would happen today, that would be all over. I mean, it would be like
everywhere.
News for weeks and weeks and weeks. But it's just like multiple scandals where $100 million or more just gets embezzled out of his administration.
I mean, you're not wrong. Actually, it might be your same historian, Jonathan Rausch. I believe he has described the federal government in the postbellum era as being in a state of constant moral decline until we reach the progressive reforms that really start to make a difference in the 1890s. And that's a good way to think of it. I mean, it's like suddenly everyone in the federal government loses anything like a moral compass.
Yeah.
And it's just about how rich can I get off my position?
Right. Is there another Jonathan Rausch? Is there a historian Jonathan Rausch?
I believe is he not a historian? He's written a couple books.
He's a journalist, I think.
Okay, but I still think he's written some history books.
Sure.
Yeah. There is a lot of overlap between.
Sure.
So, like, some of the best popular historians are historical journalists, right?
Of course.
The very first Civil War historian I ever read, I got super into the Civil War when I was like 9, and by the time I'd say I was 11, I was done with kids' books on the Civil War. I was reading.
You were into
and the first like real historian I read on the Civil War was a guy named Bruce Catton, who had 2 degrees in history and in journalism.
Gotcha. Okay. I guess
Shelby Foote, who's a really well-known narrative historian of the Civil War, history and journalism. One of my favorite popular historians today is Nathaniel Philbrick. History and journalism. Pittsburgh's own David McCullough, history and journalism. So we do a similar kind of, I mean, journalism done well is a lot of research and fact checking.
That's a good point. I guess they are
history done well is a lot of research and fact checking.
It is. You're right. I guess I was thinking that there had maybe been another Jonathan Rauch that you were referencing.
I think it's
but
the same one.
No,
I think it's the same
you're right. Because I guess in hindsight, yeah, they are much more connected than I had.
But it might, now that I think about it, though, I might have just quoted Alan Nevins. But it might have been Jonathan Rauch. Now I'm doubting.
That's okay.
One way or
all right.
the other, it is a good way to think about the government just being in constant moral decline, and eventually the people get sick of the moral decline that they see in Washington D.C. and they assume that if all of this corruption and all of this moral decline is unfolding under Republicans in D.C., then by God, it must be unfolding in every single southern state that the Republicans have taken over as well.
Right.
And then there's the financial panic of 1873, the Great Depression of the 1870s, and the longer it goes on, the worse it gets. Hundreds of banks fail, hundreds of railroad companies fail, hundreds of small businesses go under. By the time we get to the end of the Great Depression in 1877, industrial wages are down 45% on average across the nation. So it's a pretty miserable time financially, and even though the Grant administration had really nothing to do with the underlying reasons for the economic collapse of the 1870s, anybody that knows American politics know that voters hold the administration responsible.
Yeah.
When economy is good, that's to the credit of the administration, whether they had anything to do with it or not. And when the economy is bad, that's the fault of the present administration, whether they had anything to do with it or not.
Right.
And so it really dramatically undermines the public's faith in the Republican Party going into the 1876 election. And then to cycle back to the violence, the unleashing of violence against black voters in the South in 1874, 1875, and 1876 means that when we get to the 1876 election, there's literally like 1.5 million Republican voters in the South that cannot vote Republican because they'll probably be killed for it. So they just don't vote at all. And the end result of all of this is the election quagmire of 1876, where you have no clear-cut winner. Yeah. Governor Seymour of New York, running as the Democrat, clearly wins the popular vote, by more than 250,000 votes. He wins the popular vote. Mm-hmm. The Republican nominee, Rutherford B. Hayes, gets quite a few electoral college, but neither one gets enough electoral college votes.
Right, and then that goes into a whole debacle of a committee. We talked about this. Yeah. A committee that gets formed, a bipartisan committee,
congressional committee.
Yep.
It's supposed to be 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and then David Davis, the Supreme Court justice, who was viewed as the most independent mind in America at the time. But Davis really doesn't want the job, so instead he resigns. And then
from the whole job, he says
he resigns from the Supreme Court. Yep, he says, "I'm done with the Supreme Court. I'm out. I'm not doing it." Moves back to Illinois, and then Illinois will eventually very quickly send him to the Senate as one of their senators. But
really,
yeah,
is he one of the only? That can't be very common.
No. I believe he's the only Supreme Court justice to then later serve in elected office.
Now, has it ever gone the other way around? Start in the Senate and then become
a justice?
Supreme Court justice.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, but he's
and
one
we've
of the
had one president that became a Supreme Court justice, and William Howard Taft. After his presidency, he became, and we have one president who went back to electoral politics, and John Quincy Adams as well. But no, David Davies is the only Supreme Court justice to leave the bench and then enter the electoral fray. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry,
he won't do it. They end up picking another Supreme Court justice who was a Lincoln appointee and had been a well-known Republican before that, and so it skews the committee the committee says, well, will Rutherford B. Hayes won? And all the Democrats are like,
right.
Did he, though?
Because the question the committee was trying to answer was, did corruption and violence and the use of force sway elections in, what was it, 3 states?
Yeah, in Florida, Florida, South Carolina, and Mississippi. In those 3 states, did violence and corruption, because both states returned 2 different electoral college returns, right? Obviously, one saying Hayes won, and the other saying that Seymour won. And then we've got that illegal electoral college member in Oregon. So there's 20 electoral college votes total that need to be decided. Hayes is exactly 20 electoral college votes short of being president. Seymour is like 3 or 4 electoral votes short of being president. So Seymour gets even one of those states, and he's president. Yep. So Republicans need all 20 electoral votes to skew towards Hayes to hold the White House. And in the end, what we get out of this is what's known as the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, where Republicans... Do we need to pause?
No. I was just looking over. No.
Republicans decide that it's so imperative to hold the executive branch that they're willing to agree to an end to Reconstruction and to abandon protections for the freedmen in the South in order to make that happen. So really, it's just one of those really, really disappointing moments in American history. You know? Yeah.
What is and this might be an obvious question, but I'm sure there's some parts of this that don't really get discussed too much. What is what do you think the most defining aspect of Lincoln's presidency is? Of his legacy as a president?
I mean, saving the Union is a big one.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest one.
I mean, arguably, he's the greatest commander-in-chief we've ever had, although I do think you have to give FDR some credit for being a really great commander, and although FDR doesn't see it out to the end, right?
Right.
But I don't know. I think what I think anybody who's interested in politics and leadership and understanding what makes a great leader great really needs to understand Lincoln's humility and his flexibility. Lincoln knew that he didn't know everything. And so he was always willing to entertain new ideas, new concepts. He always knew that he had more to learn. And that open-mindedness of Lincoln's, that mental flexibility, I think is really more than anything what defines his presidency. It is what allowed him to save the Union. It is what allowed him to abolish slavery. It is what he transformed in his attitude towards African Americans from 1861 until his death in 1865. In 1861, Lincoln was not a race equalist, not at all. Lincoln hated slavery. He believed it was a moral wrong. He believed it was a political wrong. He believed that it economically retarded the progress of our country. But Lincoln 1860, 1861 never would have endorsed the idea of black men voting, never would have endorsed the idea of land redistribution or reparations. But a series of conversations he has with Frederick Douglass, followed by the performance of African American soldiers in the Union ranks, Lincoln's totally transformed on this idea. Lincoln goes from thinking the best thing to do for the slaves once they're all free is send them back to Africa to believing absolutely not. These are Americans as much as anybody else. This is their land. Their blood, sweat, and tears are in the soil of this country, and they're entitled to be. I don't want to go so far as to claim Lincoln became like a black nationalist or anything along, but he did believe that at the very least, black veterans should have the right to vote. And from black veterans, the conversation should then be expanded to educated and propertied black men. And so Lincoln is growing more liberal on his views toward race equality. He's growing more liberal on his views toward land redistribution. Lincoln was really encouraged by what he saw going on in South Carolina and Georgia in the land that was being taken from the plantation owners and given over to the former slaves. Lincoln had high hopes that the West might be a land of great opportunity for the freedmen, where they could go and escape the albatross around their neck of white supremacy and build a state and a culture free from all of that. Even his progress on emancipation, right? I mean, Lincoln takes office and he gives this really famous newspaper interview with the New York Tribune where he says, if I could win this war tomorrow and not free any slaves, I would do it. And if I could end this war tomorrow by freeing all the slaves, well, I would do that too. Because ending the war and preserving the Union is Lincoln's top priority in 1861. But bit by bit, probably faster than almost everybody who served under him, almost everybody, Lincoln came to realize pretty quickly there was no saving the Union without destroying the institution of slavery.
Right. Because
to allow slavery to persist after suppressing the rebellion only guarantees another rebellion down the road.
Right.
And so he goes from this attitude to the first Confiscation Act, the second Confiscation Act, the Emancipation Proclamation, and then the 13th Amendment, which, Lincoln was the greatest champion of the 13th Amendment, something you wouldn't have seen from him 4 years earlier. Mm-hmm. I think it's amazing. And you can look at the way his acumen as commander-in-chief develops as well, right? I mean, Lincoln did technically serve in Black Hawk's War, but he always made fun of he was a captain in the Illinois militia during Black Hawk's War, but he never saw anything like combat. Mm-hmm. And he would say, the only enemies I saw when I was a soldier was mosquitoes. Like he had no combat experience. He had no military training.
Right.
But he dedicated himself to learning and understanding strategy and tactics and the way the military worked. And he listened to his generals right up until he realized, whoa, maybe I'm listening to an idiot. And then he would get rid of that idiot and bring in somebody else until he thought, and Lincoln didn't quit on people when there were a lot of people that wanted him to fire Grant after the Battle of Shiloh because they couldn't believe the casualty numbers from Shiloh, and everybody just wanted to blame it on Grant. And Lincoln refused to dismiss Grant, refused to. Very famously, he said to his Secretary of War, I can't fire this man. He fights.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Lincoln had a keen eye for developing talent and sticking by that developing talent. I mean, it just... Flexibility of mind,
yep.
Knowing what he didn't know.
Is the
amazing leadership quality that not enough demonstrate.
Do you like the Daniel Day-Lewis movie?
I like parts of the Daniel Day-Lewis movie.
Okay.
There are some things that I think are just a little too far. And I don't understand. I mean, just from a movie critique point of view, not ending with the assassination was a huge mistake.
Oh, right, yeah.
But he's just going off to the theater. Come on, no.
Yeah, right,
you can't
right.
Build all the way up to the assassination and then not show the actual assassination. Right. I love Daniel Day-Lewis. He's a brilliant actor. Brilliant. And I really salute his efforts to try to capture Lincoln's reedy Midwest voice. Lincoln did not have a beautiful speaking voice, and I'm glad they didn't try to impose one upon him.
Right.
What made Lincoln so fascinating was with an imperfect speaking voice, his oratory was still so powerful.
Yeah.
it's easy for somebody to get wrapped up in listening to something that James Earl Jones, James Earl Jones.
Rest in peace.
Yes,
by the
of
way.
course.
Rest in
But
peace.
one of the reasons I brought him up, somebody, I was posting on Facebook after he died. I could listen to that man read the telephone book, and I would be captivated.
right. You would be all in.
Right, because just the timbre of his voice was amazing. But
Unreal.
Lincoln captivated people with his words and his ideas, and that's something else. I mean, that's really,
It is.
yeah.
How would we put a bow on this? Is there anything else about the Civil War that you would like to address before we take a jump ahead? We're jump ahead about 100 years.
Don't romanticize the Civil War. This does not happen here nearly as much as it happened with some of my students in Kansas. But I had certain students in Kansas that are really itching for another Civil War. They think we need it. They think it's necessary. They think a good Civil War will be a national purging, and afterwards we'll all be able to come back together far more harmonious as a people than no. Under no circumstances. Almost a million people died horrible, tragic deaths.
Where does this come from? This like romanticization of like war. What is that quote? Like, war looks really sexy to all the people that haven't been through one.
Yeah. Yes. Well. Yeah. Well, how do most people learn about war these days, Carson?
Video games.
Video games and
media, just movies.
And how do movies and video games make war seem?
They always
It's
like
a grand adventure.
Right.
You shoot and you shoot and you shoot and you never really get hurt.
So I don't know if you saw. Did you see the movie 1917?
Oh, I love that.
It was amazing, but I thought that did a really good job at like making it seem scary as fuck.
Yes,
like, sorry, I didn't mean to swear, but like just really like genuine.
No, I mean there
really
are
scary.
some really good anti-war movies out there as well. 1917 is a great example. I don't actually think there's a great version of All Quiet on the Western Front out there, but man, what a powerful novel to get an overwhelmingly anti-war message.
Yeah.
Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory and Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, two great examples of Platoon from Oliver Stone, really strong anti-war message. There are some really good anti-war movies out there that do try to strip away the romanticism. I mean, even Saving Private Ryan, I think that movie tries to walk a fine line. It does not romanticize the violence, although clearly we know who the heroes are in that film. I think that's And you've got these popular historians that run around on podcasts and in poorly written books that try to talk up this event like it's something to be positive about as well. I don't know. I don't know where the strain of thought comes from. It is growing exponentially. I get questions from students all the time. Do you think we're headed for another Civil War? I've been doing this since I was 29, so that's like 15 years I've been teaching in higher education in some capacity, one way or another. And I would occasionally get that question, but really it is in the last 5 or 6 years that it is really, I get students asking me all the time, do you think we're headed for another Civil War? Do you think we're headed for another Civil War?
Yeah.
I do think part of that also is the gun violence.
Sure.
And I mean, like, how can it not start crossing your mind when we just seem to be shooting each other all the time over nothing? If we're willing to shoot each other because we're mad about traffic, my God, what aren't we willing to shoot each other over?
Right.
And I do think that feeds into some of the. But I will tell you, my general answer to this question is no. No, I do not think we're headed towards another Civil War. Right. Don't romanticize the one we fought. Don't romanticize the idea of a future one, but I don't see an issue that we're so divided on that we're actually willing to mass murder each other over
Did you watch the A24?
I did.
What did you
Garland's
What did you think about that?
I really like Alex Garland. I loved him when he was a screenwriter. His screenplay for Dredd is. I mean, I love the new Dredd movie. I wanted to love Civil War. I wanted to love it, and there were things about it I did love, but I thought he copped out a lot. I thought.
In what way?
Well, first of all, every time that Kirsten Dunst's character has a flashback, she's flashing back to horrible things she witnessed in Africa or in the Mideast. If this is supposed to be about an American Civil War that we are years into, and she is a photojournalist during the course of that whole Civil War, why aren't we seeing images of the terrible things Americans might do to each other in a Civil War?
That's
that
an
we
interesting
fight?
point. I didn't think about that.
And then, context clues do help you piece together what the root cause of this Civil War was, right? Obviously, some kind of elected official gets into office and then refuses to admit defeat and won't give up and tries to use the power of the federal government to stay in office, and then somehow California and Texas join together, which I guess maybe that's one of my other problems. I don't see a world in which California and Texas necessarily come galloping together.
Do you think?
But who knows?
Maybe economically.
Maybe economically, they are the two largest American economies by state.
Isn't that what we thought? Gavin was like, maybe this would be some sort of economic alliance. I loved it. I love the movie. And you do make, those are good points. Like, those are good points. It was kind of goofy when we saw the trailer, like Texas-California alliance is a little silly, but I thought that the fact that it was not ideological was brilliant. Like, expressly. There was not, like, there was the president saying that he was, like, Ron Swanson as the president, which is very funny. Not leaving office. So there was, like, an implication of why the war started, but I think it did a good job at just showing like senseless violence, like random acts of violence.
Yeah.
And how like devastating that would be just to everyday people.
Yeah. Yes. I still think it could have gone further. I don't know. I think if he wanted to shock us, he left a whole lot of shocking material out.
Oh, I was disturbed personally. But sure. Yeah, I mean it definitely wasn't it wasn't perfect. But I enjoyed it. I thought it was good. Yeah.
Again, I mean, I've seen a whole lot of movies this year. I saw just about everything that's come out in the theaters between like May and August, and I definitely would put it in probably my top 10. Probably my top.
Sure.
But it hasn't been a strong summer either. So.
Well, no. I was gonna say, the movies that are coming out are horrific.
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump ahead here. What has What is the like full story of the America's battle against communism been like in the full context? Because this is, I mean, and I try not to go too hard into like specific politics on this show. I don't, but this idea that Kamala Harris is a communist is
it's absurd.
This is just the most absurd thing I have like ever. I mean, to call Joe Biden a communist is.
America has never had anything close.
Not even close.
We haven't even had anything close. Bernie Sanders is probably the closest we've ever gotten to someone that looks like a social democrat.
Right.
But a social democrat is still a far cry from a communist.
Right.
But it's been a dog whistle that's worked in America for the last 150 years, right?
Yeah. And specifically wanting to look at the... So there was a Red Scare in the 18...
So the first Red Scare comes with the first efforts of unionization during the Second Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
In the 1870s and 1880s, as American workers are trying to form labor unions, there is a strong socialist component to that labor movement, and unfortunately, socialism, there isn't just one kind of socialism.
Right. There's many flavors.
There's many flavors, and in American socialism, starting really in the 1880s, in the early 1880s, after the American socialists hold their national conference in Pittsburgh, there's a clear division that develops in American socialism. Those who believe that violence is necessary to overthrow the system and seize control of the means of production that way, versus socialists who think that using the power of voting in the ballot and getting laborers to vote in their own best interest is how gradually, bit by bit, that you come to control the means of production. Well, right away, we focus just on the violent social. All socialists are violent then, right? If there's some violent socialists, they're all violent socialists. This is a time in American politics when business interests and the wealthy really control national politics, just absolutely control national politics.
Yes.
Everybody's on the take. Everybody's getting kickbacks. Senators and representatives and cabinet members invest in companies that they then pass legislation to support monopolies for.
That sounds oddly familiar.
What? I don't know what you're talking about. It's unconscionable. It's unconscionable what was going on. And so business owners, wealthy industrialists, robber barons, cattle barons, they all have an interest in seeing the socialist element. Well, they want to see labor unions destroyed. Period.
Right.
And the labor unions do make themselves most vulnerable through the violent socialists who emerge, led by men like Johann Most. And then authorities seize on that. And they're like, look at these violent, crazy, uncontrollable union socialists.
Yeah.
And that's the first sort of soft Red Scare. What we generally identify as the first true Red Scare emerges in the wake of the First World War, because the Russian Revolution unfolds, and everybody gets really worried after the Russian Revolution allows communism, which is just a name for extreme socialism, to take over Russia. Many Americans believe that the communist revolution is coming here next. Why? Well, we're the most industrialized nation in the world, right? If an industrial workers' revolution could take place in Russia, my God, we have so many more factories than Russia. Imagine what could happen here. The wealth disparity in the United States wasn't incomparable to the wealth disparity between the Russian aristocrats and all the peasants still laboring in Russia. But there were also a whole lot of other... The idea that what happened in Russia was going to unfold in the United States was far-fetched, but it didn't stop people from bringing those fears back with them. And so the 1920s are a period of great... that's the first real Red Scares, the 1920s. You have to make sure America doesn't fall... And once again, American labor unions are a key target of this anti-communist, anti-socialist message. Whether or not they're actually and then the stock market crashes in 1929, right? And 1928, and the Great Depression is upon us. And the 1930s will actually see the rise of American socialism to heights it had never experienced before. At the exact same time, though, you've got American fascism rising in the 1930s in a way that we've never seen since. And these two are eventually put on a collision course that comes in the 1950s. Obviously, World War II ends, and we make strange bedfellows with communists during World War II.
Yes.
Right? By 1939, the United States has a choice. Like, what is a greater evil in the world, fascism or communism? And the United States decides that fascism is actually the greater threat to the future prosperity and security of the United States. So we move into, we become strange bedfellows with Joseph Stalin.
It's like an enemy of my enemy is my friend
correct.
kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. that doesn't hold for very long.
Right, which doesn't that initially happens, or at least I understand that like that the main reason why that's like when Hitler invades
Correct.
Russia, that's
Yes.
kind of the catalyst
That is
for
correct.
Stalin joining loosely joining the Allied powers for a hot second.
Yes,
to
so
defeat.
the Soviets and Nazi Germany were technically at peace through something known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was a non-aggression pact that the Soviet Union and the Third Reich agreed to, which essentially said, we won't attack you and you don't attack us, and we're both going to pillage the hell out of Poland, right?
Right, because the communists and the Nazis hated each other. Hated each other.
So fascism and communism are diametrically opposed philosophies. Nothing drives me crazier in the current political, I shouldn't say nothing, but one of the things that drives me crazy in the current extreme language of political discourse is when I hear people described as fascist communists. I'm like, guys, they can't be like
No.
Now it is true that the political spectrum is not a straight line. It is instead a horseshoe.
Yes.
So there are times when fascism and communism kind of can look alike.
Sure.
But they hate each other. By definition, they hate each other.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, there can't be any such thing as a fascist communist.
No, that's silly.
But after Hitler captures Paris and France capitulates, his hubris is at an all-time high, and he's like, maybe Napoleon couldn't do it, but I'm twice as great as Napoleon. And,
Right.
And off he goes to invade Russia and violate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty. And man, the Soviets just do to Hitler the exact same thing that they did to Napoleon.
Didn't he invade during the winter?
Well, no, he doesn't invade during the winter.
Okay.
Just like Napoleon, he invades in early summer.
Okay.
But just like against Napoleon, the Russians just keep pulling back and pulling back and pulling back, forcing Nazi Germany to invade deeper and deeper and deeper, drawing their supply lines out further and further and further. And then the Nazis, the German army gets way down in places like, darn. Now I can't remember that key.
The Russians have a lot of land to work
They
with,
do.
so they can just
do.
keep forcing them
all
out
the way
and
to the
then-
gates of Moscow, just like, and then the Russians dig their heels in and start fighting back. But months have passed, and suddenly the German army is fighting in the winter, and they don't have enough gasoline, they don't have enough kerosene, they don't have enough winter clothing, they don't have enough winter food supplies.
Tanks get stuck.
And they are devastated. The exact same way Napoleon. I mean, it is literally history repeating itself.
Yeah.
It's literally history repeating. But never get involved in a land war in Asia.
No,
never,
you cannot do
never.
it. It's a bad idea.
Japan is undone by its land war in Asia. The United States is undone by its second land war in Asia. Well, third, but neither.
Well,
we fought 3 land wars in Asia.
What number are we on now?
2 of them went fairly poorly for us. One of them, we achieved our goal. Korea. But that was a peninsula. And it makes it much easier when you're fighting on a peninsula.
Right. And then after into the Cold War.
So as soon as World War II is over, Stalin will not disband his army. He won't do it. Mm-hmm. And so then the United States and England and Canada were like, well, we didn't want to keep these big armies, but we can't just let the Iron Curtain descend, because the Iron Curtain very rapidly descends on Eastern Europe. Stalin had promised during the war that after the war was over, he would allow all of Eastern Europe to hold free and open elections. Well, that does not happen.
No.
It just does not happen. And then confrontations come. In Greece, the West decides that it has to help Greece defend itself against against Soviet agents that are trying to install in Turkey. It's the exact same thing. In Italy, although it doesn't get nearly as violent in Italy as it did in Turkey and
Sure.
Greece. And so, yeah, I mean, by 1946, we're in the Cold War.
Yeah.
We still play nice for a couple years, but we're
A little bit.
clearly in the Cold War
Yeah.
by 1946. And then 1949, the Soviets explode their first nuclear weapon, and
then
that's
and then it's off to the races.
Yeah, and then American fear of communism catapults, absolutely catapults, and that sets the table for Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, who at a meeting, I believe it was the Wheeling, West Virginia Women's Auxiliary Group.
Yes,
that is when he first claims to have in his possession a secret list of 110 communists that are part of Truman's administration, and they must be driven out of the executive branch of the, and of course there was no list, but it sets up a long witch hunt in American politics and in American entertainment. Nobody is more impacted by the Second Red Scare or by McCarthyism than the American entertainment industry. Academia suffers too. I don't want to make it seem like politicians who flirted with communism in any way, shape, or form suffer the most. But I would say the entertainment industry suffers the second most, followed by academia after that.
Yeah. I think that was the one thing, and we did briefly talk about this before, but I think that was the one thing that was good about Oppenheimer was like illustrating the fear. It's like, well, you don't want to be stuck going to the Red Party or whatever, the communist meeting is like this like deep social pressure.
And under McCarthyism, I mean, like if you had even been a dues paying member of the American Communist Party for like a year in the 1930s in the midst of the Great Depression, it was impossible to deny that you still carried communist sympathies, right? And it's the undoing of so many people. And man, Eisenhower hated it. I mean, Eisenhower is a Republican, just like McCarthy, but he really hated what was going on. And then, I mean, eventually it does come to a screeching halt, but the power of the communist dog whistle never really went away after that.
No, and then what's weird is that, and this just looking like in my lifetime, like communism was always, as soon as I became like politically conscious, communism was always something that was, because I was a lot more conservative when I was younger, so it was always like something that I kind of opposed, and I'm still not like a fan of it now, but it's just so weird that all of a sudden it's been brought back for this election as...
Well, so, I mean, I do think China does play a part in this, right?
Sure. So that's a good point.
And, I mean, Russia might not be communist, but
they're basic.
What is it?
It's
an oligarchy? A plutocracy?
I think...
It doesn't look...
They have a lot of oligarchs.
That's true.
They have a lot of oligarchs. I don't know if
it couldn't be because Putin prevents it from being a... He's
an oligarch, basically.
He wields as much power as any Russian leader since Stalin, right? Yeah. I say that because as much as I despise him, he is not Stalin. He's not.
No.
Stalin purged at least 25 million of his own people.
At least
we have no evidence.
Aren't those like lowball numbers?
Yeah, those are lowball numbers. Yes.
Yeah, I mean the gulags.
Yeah.
The Gulag archipelago.
Putin does use gulags, right?
Oh, sure.
Navalny, is that right?
Navalny
was
in a gulag.
Died in a gulag, right?
Right.
But the gulags aren't used as much as they were. And again, there's no mass execution. There's no mass purges the way there were under Lenin or Stalin. I mean, we romanticize Lenin, but he was a very violent man as well.
Yeah, that's still one that doesn't make any sense to me. Why we would romanticize Lenin?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, because he wasn't as bad as Stalin, right?
Right.
So, if we're comparing terrible people,
right?
Yeah, it's and then the Soviet Union collapses. I mean, and then like communism is defeated, except it's never really defeated because
No.
Cuba's still there,
Yep.
and China's still there, and North Korea's still there.
But oddly enough, Russia was like the face of communism and now I feel like it is China. Like I feel like when conversations
But
about
communism
Russia
looks
happen,
so much different now,
Yeah,
too, right?
yeah.
Like China is like communism light. It's
Yeah.
communist in its government, but it is very capitalist in its economy, right? And that's how.
Well, yeah, I guess other than the fact that like anytime a company wants to do anything, it has to have government approval.
Yes,
But other than that, yeah. I mean,
But there's great wealth accumulation
Yeah.
in China. Yes, their government controls. I mean, like you can't. We all know you can't get on the internet. You can't just go buy whatever book you want in China. But they have embraced free market capitalism as much as any communist nation could, right?
you sure?
And it's part of what has made. And we can't forget that this is all Nixon's fault.
Right.
But in the time, you understand why Nixon made the decision that he did, right? Strengthen China to drastically weaken the Soviet Union.
Sure.
It was a strategy, but it is interesting that when you look at the threats to American security today, two of, I would say, the four greatest threats we face are communist in their government function, which continues to give the accusation of communist power in our American politics, even though we don't really understand what we mean when we say it. We just know that it's bad.
Yeah. Right. It's like a weird boogeyman.
It is. It's a weird boogeyman
Kinda thing.
that really, which I mean, if you've ever read the Communist Manifesto,
Which I have not.
I recommend it. It is a really interesting critique of capitalism from like an economist point of view, right? Like
Sure.
that is sometimes what people forget about Marx and Engels. They were economic philosophers. This is not an endorsement of communism.
No,
by the
no,
way.
I mean,
I am not a communist, but
The other
I do
thing-
think everyone should at least read the Communist Manifesto once in their life.
The other weird thing too is that Marxism has been turned into this very strange,
Right.
Like apparently Kamala Harris is a Marxist communist, which I am not so convinced.
Well, I mean, I suppose every communist is by definition a Marxist, but
Sure.
not every Marxist is a communist. So,
No, and Kamala Harris happens to be neither of the two.
Right. And like even when you try to pull her dad into it, he was a professor, and one of the things he taught was Marxist economy. But that's like saying because I teach Keynesian economy, I have nothing to do with how the economy functions. I just teach it. Like
Right.
I can't be a Keynesian because I don't work for the federal treasury.
Yeah.
You know, like, so the idea that even her father was a Marxist economist, well, I mean, I suppose in some, but only as a theorist.
Right. This guy's not making economic policy, implementing it, right?
Exactly. He's redistributing no property anywhere.
Right. And so speaking of that, I wanted to go back to the pendulum thing we talked about earlier. When you talked about how it's, and I do agree, it seems to swing back and forth, right? Conservatism was the dominant culture in this country for a very long time, perhaps still is. It does seem in some ways that, I don't know what you want to call it, but some sort of left-leaning culture did kind of take hold of academia, corporations. Entertainment has always kind of leaned left over the last couple of years. Do you think do you think we're gonna see a swing back anytime soon? Is that a generational thing? Is it based on something geopolitical? What causes the pendulum to swing back and forth?
Sure, no, that's a really good question. One of the crazy things about our times is the pendulum seems to be swinging faster.
It's very fast
than it has in the past.
Yeah,
the
it's very
pendulum
fast.
swings really fast, and it didn't used to quite swing so fast.
No.
Are we, by nature, a conservative nation? That's a good question. I believe that humans, by nature, are conservative mammals, right?
Sure,
Like,
yeah,
our primary instinct is to survive.
Yep.
And as humans, what we tend to believe is the best way to survive is by maintaining the status quo.
Yes. Tribalism is also evolutionarily very beneficial.
Right.
The in-group, out-group kind of thing.
And that ties you into a more conservative mindset as well. However, within that instinct towards conservatives, obviously, as you just said, that creates in-groups and out-groups.
Yeah.
And the out-groups have a voice, and they will voice their concerns. And the pendulum swings when those on the inside start actually listening to what those on the outside are saying and realizing, oh, there might be an argument here, right? There might be something to be said for what the out-group is saying about the way our society is currently structured. And that's what begins to swing to the left. But we're born as a nation in a moment of tremendous radicalism. And so that also makes it difficult to say that we're inherently a conservative nation because our founding ideology is anti-conservative. The belief that all mankind is created equal and endowed by their creator with certain rights, principle among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, that's... I know it doesn't feel radical 250 years later, but that was
very radical.
Very radical.
Yeah.
And American radicalism has never disappeared since Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. It's been with us ever since.
This was something that I had also got from Tim Urban's book that I had not known about before, but this is an open letter written by the Ripon Society to, I forget exactly who it was written to. I think Barry Goldwater.
Oh,
This was in '64.
Okay.
This came out, and it was about how written, and I believe this was written by Republicans at the time that were urging the future of the party platform to be moderation, not extremism.
Yeah.
And they said, I just really liked this. The moderate recognizes that there are a variety of means available to him, but that there are no but that there are no simple, unambiguous ends. He recognizes hundreds of desirable social goals where the extremist may only see a few. The moderate chooses the center, not because it is halfway between left and right. He is more than a non-extremist. He takes this course since it offers him the greatest possibility of constructive achievement. Moderation is not a full-blown political philosophy claiming the answer to all of our problems. It is rather a point of view, a plea for political sophistication, for a skepticism towards total solutions. And it seems like right now the Republican Party is, well, maybe both parties arguably, but it seems like the way that the pendulum is swinging, it almost doesn't feel like, to me at least, it doesn't feel like this election that we're approaching. It doesn't even feel in some ways like a left versus right thing anymore. It feels like a populism versus
normalism,
I guess, right? Or like whatever you would call like the establishment, whatever you would call that. That's what it feels like.
I don't fully disagree with that. I do think
there are obviously distinctions between left and right, but it's this weird thing of like, why are people like Tulsi Gabbard and like RFK Jr. not to mention like any like hot button topic like controversial names, but like why are some of these people that were Democrats for so long all of a sudden jumping on the train of Trump, which is this right-wing populism movement, which happens to also be springing up across Europe? They're also experiencing some of this.
Yeah, no, I wish I had an easy answer to this question, Carson. I'd be on every late night talk show,
right.
healing the problems of the world.
And do you think that the center can still hold this thing? Do you think that the moderates in the middle can still hold the pendulum from going too far one way or the other?
Yeah. Wow. Can the center hold? To famously quote Achebe, when the center cannot hold, things fall apart.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I believe the American moderation will hold. Although I've I've grown more and more reluctant to make predictions after 2016 because
Every
I'm
single
just
prediction
wrong all the time.
every single prediction I've made on this show has been wrong. I have a 0% track record of predicting anything correctly. So if you would like to fire off a prediction that might be wrong, this is actually the space to do it.
I think to go back to the point that humans are conservative by nature because they want to maintain as much of the status quo as they can. I think that's going to be the deciding factor in all of this because, I mean, obviously, we've become a much more politically engaged country over the last decade. However you feel about what's unfolded in the last, I mean, 155 million people voted in the last election, unheard. I still think that was only 58% of registered voters, but still, I mean, over 50. God, imagine if we get up back to 70 and 80% like we used to be. In terms, anyway,
that's 200. That's over 200 million people voting.
Insane number of voters.
Yeah.
I think as we move closer and closer to the election, Americans are going to start asking themselves this question more and more. Which party keeps my life as normal as possible? Mm-hmm. And I know that sometimes that can depend on your perspective.
Sure.
Again, I was in Kansas for 6 years, in rural Kansas for 6 years, and I heard all the fear and paranoia and worrying and name calling about everyone on the American left, and what they think we're doing to what they think the left is doing to their country, the threats that the left poses to freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of speech. But I think the majority of American voters are going to take a look at normalcy and realize that populism doesn't promise you normalcy. Populism promises you tremendous upheaval, and then let the cards fall where they lie.
Yeah. Anytime there's chaos like that, there's not a historic precedent for stability emerging from that a lot of the time.
Right.
A lot of times revolutions end in another bad situation, which just gives you another moment of instability.
Yeah.
Again.
Right. But when you look at who has gravitated, I mean, you mentioned Tulsi Gabbard, you mentioned RFK Jr. You could also throw Naomi Wolf in there as well.
Sure.
All these people that once seemed to be bastions in American democracy and liberalism, and now, well, I don't know about RFK so much. I mean, he's always been crazy. And the fact that he took his anti-vaxxer crusade into the administration that talked about injecting bleach. Wouldn't it be great if we could just do that and that would clean up everybody's COVID? Or what was the horse? Ivermectin.
Yeah.
It seems like a natural home for RFK. Naomi Wolf also got super caught up in the anti-vax conspiracy theories, and I think that in a large way, MAGA populism is a really big umbrella. People like to pretend like it's not, but it is.
It is.
Almost whatever you believe, there's a home for you in MAGA.
Yes, somehow.
Populism, as long as you recognize who the leader of the movement is, there's a home for you there.
Yeah.
And so I do think that gives it a certain broad appeal to people that have felt voiceless for a long time.
Yeah.
But I'm going to stick with Nixon's silent majority on this one. I just lambasted Nixon, but now I'm going to use his very own language. I believe that in this election cycle, the silent majority is going to speak against populism.
Okay, we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens.
We're gonna have to wrap up here pretty soon, so we're gonna
Yeah.
get to some final questions here. What advice do you have for young people?
Just in general?
Sure. I mean, I guess young people that want to be historians or that want to go into history.
Oh, okay, sure.
Or I mean, any direction you would like to take this.
Sure.
A piece of advice that you wish you'd gotten in your younger years that you would now like to give to young people.
Sure.
And any of the above.
Yes. First, don't watch the news. And I don't...
I agree with those strong supporters of that on this show.
Read.
Right.
Read, and then read some more.
Yep.
Reading can make you emotional, and reading can have emotional language in it. But when you read it in your own voice.
Yep.
And you determine where that emotion is, and you determine how you're going to let it emotionally affect you. Too much news today tries to be emotionally manipulative, and
Yes.
it wants to do your thinking for you. News today with a hand. I mean, to be fair, I do like This Week on ABC on Sunday mornings. I think they do a really good job leaving the critical thinking to the viewer. That is probably the one news program I watch on a consistent basis. BBC World Report is on PBS is usually pretty good too, especially because what I like about that is the international perspective.
Sure.
But in general, you just read, and it doesn't look. Read the New York Times, read the Post-Gazette, read the Atlantic, read the Wall Street Journal. Read the daily publications every day because that helps you stay informed. But move beyond that. Dive deep into topics that interest you. If you think Jeffersonian philosophy is something that you want to learn more about, then learn more about it. And never exclude fiction from your reading. Fiction teaches us empathy. Fiction teaches us humanity. Fiction teaches us to understand that our life experience can be reflected in other people's lives, but also it reminds us that people live experiences that we can never really understand. The humanities teach us to be human, and remember that. It's important to remember that. Second thing I would say is trust your gut, trust your instincts. Almost my whole life, I have stood by what my instincts told me, and it's very rarely stirred me wrong. And actually, even then, I don't think it's ever when I've ignored my instincts is generally the moments that I look back on in my life are moments of what are great moments of regret or moments that I feel of personal failure. They're generally moments when I instinctively knew what to do, but I didn't do it. Right. And the great pivot points in my life are the same thing. Like, I loved being a theater major at Point Park. I never want to denigrate that, ever. But in that moment during my senior year, in that acting class, when it just like an epiphany dawned on me, this isn't your future, I knew it was right. And I never questioned that. And I've never questioned it. And I know it was the right decision to make for me. When I chose Temple University over University of North Carolina, even though I had a much more generous fellowship offer from North Carolina, it was trusting my gut, and that I know that was the right decision to make. I thrived at Temple in a way that I don't know I would have done at UNC. So yeah, trust your instincts. And then the final thing I would say, this was something I've taught a lot of freshmen like seminar courses. Like, this is how you be successful in college. This is how you be successful in life. I cannot stress enough the importance of the mind-body-spirit connection to be happy and successful in your life. Find some sort of physical activity
Yep.
that brings you. You don't have to be good at it.
No.
It's not about being good, but it is about making sure that you are keeping yourself, your heart beating, your lungs working. It could be golf. It could be bowling. It doesn't have to be the most cardiovascular, strenuous exercise, but find something, walking, running, playing flicker ball or ultimate frisbee with your friends, whatever it is. Find something that brings you physical satisfaction and make it part of your daily routine.
Yep.
Read every single day. Your mind is the single most important muscle in your body, and it needs to be worked out more than anything else.
It does.
And then the spirit connection, find your Zen,
Yep.
right? For some people, maybe that means church and prayer. For other people, maybe that means yoga in the park.
Yep.
But find out, get introspective and find in yourself what brings you inner peace and make sure that becomes part of your daily routine as well.
Yeah.
Mind, body, spirit. You need to exercise all three every single day.
Yep. Touching grass does wonders.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Get outdoors.
It's a funny meme,
but it's true.
but it's so true. Like, just get out and touch grass. Go in the do something.
Yep.
You know.
And then I guess if I have one more,
Sure.
never going back to Lincoln, never stop working towards self-improvement.
Yep.
Never stop being introspective. If you want to see change in this world, the most effective way to make that happen is by changing yourself. And living the example that you want other people to see and model. And if we all do that collectively, we make the world a better place.
Yep. I like it. Well, we're at time here. We didn't even get to everything.
I'm sorry.
No.
I get too verbose.
No, of course, no. I love it. That's why you're here, of course. Willis, we'll have to do this again.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you,
fun.
Dr. Wolf.
Thank you, Carson.
Appreciate you.
Thanks, Gavin.
Yep. Have a nice day, everybody. We'll see you out there.